Name of the story, The Inheritance. This story will help you fall asleep, so before we get started, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and comment at what time you are watching. Now relax and enjoy the story. The air had an uncanny stillness as the Ford family drove through the winding roads that led to their new home. Elizabeth, the matriarch, glanced at her husband, Greg, who gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. Their two children, Emily and Lucas, sat quietly in the back seat, each absorbed in their own thoughts, unaware of the strange weight pressing down on them all. It had been a strange few weeks since the sudden death of Elizabeth's estranged uncle, Charles Whitaker. No one had expected him to pass, especially not with his wealth and his age. He'd always been an enigma to the family, a man whose vast fortune was matched only by his eccentricity. And now, through a surprising twist of fate, the family was inheriting his mansion. "Not much longer now," Greg said, breaking the silence. His voice was thick with hesitation, as though he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Elizabeth sighed, adjusting her sunglasses as she stared out of the window. The mansion, she thought, was something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. She'd only visited it once as a child, an imposing structure on the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods and fog. Even then, it had seemed more like a forgotten relic of some old story, something she would never fully understand. Now it was theirs. Emily, a bright-eyed 15-year-old, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Do you think we'll find anything interesting?" Her voice was innocent, but there was an underlying curiosity in her eyes. She was the adventurous type, always looking for excitement, even in the most ordinary of places. Elizabeth gave her a soft smile. "I'm sure there will be plenty to explore. It's a huge house." She tried to sound reassuring, but her voice faltered. There was something about the mansion that unsettled her, a nagging sense of foreboding that had clung to her since the lawyer had called about the inheritance. It felt too sudden, too strange. Lucas, her younger son, was barely 9 years old. He leaned forward, his small hands pressed against the window, peering out at the rolling hills. "It looks big," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Will we be able to play outside?" "I suppose," Greg replied, though his voice was distracted. His mind seemed preoccupied with thoughts of what the house would be like, and whether they'd be able to make the place feel like a home. His thoughts wandered to the numerous tasks that awaited him, repairs, maintenance, perhaps even renovations. But what truly plagued his mind was the house's history. No one knew much about it except that Charles had been a recluse, an eccentric genius, and a man of strange habits. It wasn't just the size or the beauty of the mansion that was intimidating. It was the mystery that shrouded it. As they neared the mansion's entrance, the road grew narrower, and the trees on either side thickened, their dark branches seeming to reach toward them. The mist had begun to settle in, curling around the trees like a creeping fog. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. Elizabeth stared at the mansion looming ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the haze. The imposing structure seemed to rise out of the mist itself, its towers piercing the sky. The front of the house was a strange blend of grandiosity and neglect, with ivy creeping up its stone walls, covering parts of the windows. Despite its outwardly majestic appearance, there was something unsettling about it. The car turned off the main road and onto the gravel driveway, which crunched under the tires. The family could finally see the mansion in full view. It was as grand as they had imagined, yet it held a sense of loneliness, as though it had stood empty for years. The once vibrant gardens were overgrown, the hedges twisted and wild. Statues of forgotten ancestors stood like silent sentinels, their features weathered and faded. As the car came to a halt in front of the grand entrance, the door swung open with a creak, and an elderly woman appeared. She was dressed in a dark, long coat, her face lined with age, though her eyes seemed sharp, almost calculating. "Welcome," she said in a gravelly voice. "You must be the Whitakers. I am Miss Marjorie. I've been taking care of the house for Mr. Charles." He was a unique man. Elizabeth stepped out of the car, her eyes scanning the house one last time. There was something about Miss Marjorie that was unsettling, though she couldn't put her finger on it. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're the Whitakers. I'm Elizabeth, and these are my children, Emily and Lucas, and my husband, Greg." Miss Marjorie gave a small nod. "I'll show you around," she said, her voice cold but polite. "There's a lot to see, and there are rules you must follow. Your uncle was very particular about the house." Greg felt a shiver run down his spine. There was again something strange about the house. Charles had left behind his fortune, but he had also left behind a set of rules. What kind of rules? They followed Miss Marjorie into the grand foyer, which was as magnificent as the rest of the house. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and a grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, though its crystals were dulled with age. "Where are the others?" Elizabeth asked, glancing around. "I thought there would be more family here." Miss Marjorie's gaze flickered, a brief flash of something. Was it sadness? Regret? Before her expression returned to its usual mask of neutrality. "You're the only ones. Your uncle had no other heirs, not after. Well, not after what happened." "What happened?" Greg asked, his curiosity piqued. But Miss Marjorie only shook her head. "You'll understand soon enough," she said cryptically. "Now follow me." They followed Miss Marjorie through the dimly lit corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone floors, amplifying the silence that hung in the air. Elizabeth felt a strange heaviness settle in her chest as they walked deeper into the mansion. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, its hallways twisting and turning, each room seeming to hold its own secrets, its own shadows. "Is there a reason it's so quiet?" Emily asked, her voice breaking the silence. She had always been the inquisitive one, never shy about asking questions. Miss Marjorie glanced over her shoulder at her, her face unreadable. "This house has a way of keeping its secrets," she replied in a soft, eerie tone. "Some things are better left undisturbed." Greg shot Elizabeth a look, but neither of them said anything. The house, the woman, the way everything felt, it was all too much. The further they walked, the more it seemed like the house was alive, its walls closing in around them, watching their every move. They reached the end of a long hallway and stopped in front of a large set of double doors. Miss Marjorie pushed them open with a grunt, revealing a grand library that took Elizabeth's breath away. The room was vast, filled with towering shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one packed with books. The air smelled of dust and old paper, and the dim light that filtered through the heavy curtains gave the room an almost ethereal glow. "This is where your uncle spent most of his time," Miss Marjorie said, stepping inside. "He had a fascination with the past. History, family lineage, things like that." She motioned for the family to enter. "Take your time. It's one of the few places in the house that's still intact." Greg stepped inside first, his eyes scanning the room. The library had an unsettling feel to it. Everything seemed too precise, too organized. The books were lined up neatly, but there was something about the way they were arranged that didn't sit right, almost as if they were waiting for someone to come along and disturb them. Elizabeth moved closer to the shelves, her fingers brushing against the spines of the books. Many of them were old, their titles faded and hard to read. As her hand hovered over one particularly large, leather-bound book, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She glanced up, catching her reflection in a mirror on the far wall. For a split second, She thought she saw someone standing behind her, a shadowy figure that vanished the moment she turned around. "Mom," Emily asked, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth blinked and shook her head, trying to push the unsettling feeling away. "Nothing, just tired, I guess." Greg turned away from the shelves, his eyes falling on a large, ornate desk near the back of the room. It was cluttered with papers, some of them yellowed with age, others fresh and crisp. A heavy, silver pen lay on top of a thick stack of documents. "Do you mind if I take a look at these?" Greg asked, already walking over to the desk before Miss Marjorie could respond. "Go ahead," Miss Marjorie said, her voice carrying a hint of something like warning. "But be careful. Some of the things your uncle wrote are unusual." Greg paused, glancing at her. "Unusual how?" Miss Marjorie's eyes narrowed. "You'll see." Greg sat down at the desk, picking up a sheet of paper that appeared to have been written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. The handwriting was jagged, barely legible. As he scanned the text, a cold chill crept over him. The words spoke of something ancient, something dark buried deep within the mansion's walls. There was mention of rituals, of rites that should never be performed, of bloodlines that had been tainted by an evil that had lingered for generations. Greg set the paper down quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. What was this? And why had Charles left all of this behind? "What did you find?" Elizabeth asked, her voice soft but sharp with concern. She had come up behind him, her eyes scanning the desk as well. Greg didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for another piece of paper, a letter this time, its edges worn and fragile. As he unfolded it, he noticed that it was dated only a few months before Charles's death. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, but its contents were unmistakable. "I can feel it coming. The house is alive. It knows what I've done. I have to stop it. But can I? I don't know how much longer I have before the walls close in around me. There's something buried here, something that can never see the light of day again. If I don't make it out of this, tell my family to leave. They must never return. The bloodline must end. Do not open the door." Greg felt a lump form in his throat as he read the last line. The bloodline must end? What did that even mean? And what door was Charles referring to? He looked up at Miss Marjorie, whose face had grown even more unreadable. "What is this? What did he mean by all of this?" Miss Marjorie remained silent for a long moment, her eyes flickering with something Greg couldn't quite place. Then finally she spoke. "Your uncle wasn't just a man of books and research," she said quietly. "He dabbled in things, dark things. He believed the house was cursed. And when he found out the truth, he did everything in his power to keep it from destroying your family." The words hung heavy in the air, the weight of their meaning slowly sinking in. The curse, the rituals, the bloodline. "Now that you're here," Miss Marjorie continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "the house has awoken. And it won't let you leave until it gets what it wants." The words Miss Marjorie had spoken echoed in Greg's mind like a haunting refrain. The house has awoken. The idea that the mansion could have a will of its own, something alive and waiting, filled him with an unsettling dread. He looked around the room, as though the very walls were closing in on them, pressing down with an invisible weight. The air seemed thicker, the silence more oppressive. The heavy shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, as if they were aware of their presence. Greg stood up abruptly, knocking over the papers on the desk. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, trying to shake off the sense of growing panic that gripped him. He glanced at Elizabeth, her face pale as she continued to sift through the strange documents. "This is all just nonsense, right? A paranoid old man's ramblings. We need to get out of here." Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued flipping through the papers, her fingers trembling as she read. "Greg," she said quietly, "look at this." She handed him a worn, yellowed page, the ink smudged and nearly unreadable. He squinted at it, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. The door behind the mirror must never be opened. The past cannot be undone. Blood calls to blood, and the house remembers. Greg frowned, his heart pounding in his chest. "The door behind the mirror?" he repeated, his voice low. "What is this? Is it some kind of code?" Before Elizabeth could answer, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, despite the windows being tightly shut. The chill swept over them, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to freeze. The hairs on the back of Greg's neck stood on end. He turned toward Miss Marjorie, who was standing by the door with an almost detached expression on her face. "What's happening here?" he asked, his voice shaky. "What do you mean by the house remembers?" Miss Marjorie didn't speak right away. She stared at them, her eyes narrowing as though weighing their every word. Finally she spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "This house isn't just a house. It was built on blood, a bloodline that was never meant to survive. Your uncle knew this. That's why he stayed here, locked away from the world. He tried to stop it, but in the end, the house had already chosen him." Elizabeth felt a shiver run down her spine as Miss Marjorie's words sank in. She had to understand. "What bloodline? What are you talking about?" Miss Marjorie took a slow, deliberate step forward, her frail form seeming to fill the room with an unnerving presence. "The Whitakers were never meant to inherit this mansion. You've come here, and now you've awakened something. Your uncle was the last of the line. He tried to break the curse, but the house demands blood. And now it wants more." Greg's mind raced, trying to process the weight of her words. "No, this isn't possible. This is just some old superstition, a twisted family history. Nothing more." He could feel his voice rise in frustration, but deep down, a creeping fear gnawed at him, a fear he couldn't ignore. Before anyone could say more, a loud, bone-rattling thud came from somewhere deep within the mansion. The sound echoed through the walls, so deep it almost seemed to come from within the very foundation of the house. The floor trembled beneath their feet, and the lights flickered ominously. Emily let out a startled gasp and grabbed her mother's arm. "What was that? What's happening?" The air grew colder still, and Greg's breath came out in visible puffs. He turned to Miss Marjorie, his eyes pleading for an explanation. "What's going on? What is that sound?" Miss Marjorie's face remained impassive, but her eyes flickered with something darker. "It's the house. It doesn't like intruders. You've stayed too long already. It's not going to let you leave easily." She looked over her shoulder, as if she were listening for something. "You must leave now, before it's too late." Greg felt his pulse quicken, his mind spinning with thoughts of escape. "What do you mean leave? We just got here. This doesn't make any sense." Before he could say more, the doors to the library slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The sound was deafening, the air thick with tension. Panic surged in Greg's chest, and he moved toward the door, trying to wrench it open. But it wouldn't budge. He turned back to Miss Marjorie, his face pale with fear. "What's going on? Why won't the door open? What did you do?" Miss Marjorie remained eerily still, her eyes locked on the door as if waiting for something to happen. "The house is awake now. You can't leave until it has what it wants." Greg's heart raced. The walls seemed to close in on him, the suffocating sense of dread tightening with every passing second. He turned to Elizabeth, his voice frantic. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Elizabeth stood frozen in place, staring at the mirror across the room. There was something different about it now. The reflection was distorted, shifting as though it were a separate world entirely. The shadows within the glass seemed to swirl, as if something was moving behind it, something that didn't belong in this world. "Elizabeth!" Greg shouted, grabbing her arm and trying to pull her away. But she wouldn't budge. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror, her expression a mix of fear and fascination. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. She reached out for her mother, but it was as if Elizabeth didn't hear her. She was lost in the reflection, her gaze drawn into the depths of the glass. Greg's eyes darted between his wife and the mirror. Something was wrong. He could feel it deep within him. A voice, low and insistent, seemed to echo in his mind. "Do not look into the mirror." But it was too late. Elizabeth's hand moved toward the mirror, her fingers brushing the surface. Suddenly the mirror cracked. A sharp, jagged line split the glass in two, and from within the crack came a low, guttural growl, an unnatural sound, like the deep, rumbling growl of something far too large to be contained within the confines of the mansion. The room seemed to tilt, the walls groaning under some unseen pressure, and the temperature dropped even further. "Elizabeth, no!" Greg yelled, pulling her away from the mirror with all his strength. But it was as if she was trapped, her body stiff, her eyes wide in terror. And then, from within the crack in the mirror, a figure began to emerge. The figure that emerged from the cracked mirror was like nothing Greg had ever seen. At first, it appeared to be a shadow, an absence of light that seemed to move with unnatural fluidity. It slithered out, its form shifting as though it were made of smoke or some kind of dark mist. But there was something solid about it, something tangible. Its outline began to take shape, slowly, like a figure being constructed from the very air itself. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as the dark shape began to solidify, revealing more of its form. It was humanoid, but distorted. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs long and unnaturally thin, like the branches of a tree twisted by wind and time. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a twisted mass of shadows, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer into Greg's very soul. The edges of its form flickered and shimmered, as though it wasn't fully part of this world, but something just beyond it. Elizabeth, still frozen, was now standing directly in front of the figure, her body stiff, her eyes unblinking. She was entranced by it, as if it had a pull on her, an invisible force drawing her in. Her hand reached out, trembling, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the mirror's frame. "Elizabeth!" Greg cried again, shaking her by the shoulders. But it was as though she couldn't hear him, as though she were in some kind of trance, bound to the entity that was slowly but surely stepping through the mirror. The figure made a low, guttural sound, like a deep, resonant growl, the kind that echoed in the bones rather than the ears. It was a sound of hunger, of something ancient and terrible waking after a long, dormant sleep. Greg could feel the very air in the room shift, becoming heavier, thicker, almost suffocating. The temperature dropped so drastically that his breath fogged in front of him. And then the figure moved. It didn't walk or crawl. It simply shifted forward, gliding across the room with an unsettling fluidity. The shadows around it seemed to follow, spreading through the corners of the library like a creeping plague, filling the room with darkness. As the figure came closer, Greg felt a tightness in his chest, like his body was being crushed by some unseen weight. His heart thudded painfully, his mind racing, but all he could think was how wrong it all felt. The figure extended a long, thin hand, its fingers impossibly long, the nails sharp like claws. It reached out toward Elizabeth, who stood motionless, her hand still extended in an almost desperate gesture, as if she were about to offer herself to the thing. "Elizabeth, no!" Greg shouted, lunging forward to pull her away. But before he could touch her, the figure's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with a force that made her gasp. Her eyes widened in terror as she was yanked forward, her body jerking like a puppet on a string. Greg tried to pull her back, but it was as though the world itself was resisting him. His arms felt like lead, his body frozen in place. The room seemed to stretch, the shadows closing in tighter, suffocating him. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick, as if something was strangling him from the inside. In the distance, he could hear Emily's voice, panicked and high-pitched, calling for help, but the words were muffled, as if coming from underwater. Miss Marjorie, who had been standing silently by the door, finally spoke, her voice calm but eerie. "It's already begun," she said, her eyes fixed on the figure in the mirror. "The house has claimed its prize. There's no escaping it now." Greg could barely comprehend her words. His mind was reeling, and his only focus was on Elizabeth, who was being pulled toward the shadowy figure, her face contorted in terror. "No, please," she cried out, struggling to free herself from its grip. But it was no use. The thing's hand tightened around her wrist, dragging her toward the mirror, and the shadows seemed to grow, feeding on her fear. The figure's face, or what was left of it, twisted into a grotesque smile. Its hollow eyes gleamed with a malevolent hunger, as if it had been starved for centuries and was now feasting on the terror it had evoked. Greg could feel the room beginning to warp, the walls bending and distorting, the air thickening with an overwhelming pressure. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let this thing take Elizabeth. With a surge of desperation, Greg lunged forward once more, grabbing Elizabeth's other arm and pulling with all his strength. But the thing was too strong. It yanked her forward again, and now it was pulling her closer to the mirror, her feet dragging along the cold stone floor. "Elizabeth!" Greg cried out in desperation. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to let go. His vision blurred, the shadows closing in on him, but he kept pulling. He wasn't going to lose her, not like this. Miss Marjorie's voice sliced through the chaos. "It won't help. You can't fight it." She spoke with such certainty that Greg froze, his grip on Elizabeth faltering for just a moment. The figure hissed, an inhuman sound, as it finally pulled Elizabeth toward the mirror's edge. "No," Greg whispered, his breath shallow. "No, please." And then, as if in response, something strange happened. A violent gust of wind howled through the library, knocking over books and sending papers flying into the air. The figure let out a screech, as if it were being pushed back by some unseen force. The shadows retreated for a moment, and Greg, with everything he had left, pulled Elizabeth away from the mirror. With a final desperate tug, he yanked her back, pulling her into his arms just as the figure lashed out one last time. The mirror shook violently, its surface rippling as though something was trying to break free from within. But for now, the figure was gone, retreating back into the glass, leaving only the fractured reflection of the room behind. Elizabeth collapsed in his arms, gasping for breath, her body trembling with fear. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as if she had just woken from a nightmare. "Mom!" Emily cried, rushing to her side. "What happened? Are you okay?" Greg didn't answer immediately. He was still staring at the mirror, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind spinning. What had that thing been? Where had it come from? And why had it wanted Elizabeth? As the room slowly settled, the wind died down, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted just slightly, Greg found himself staring at Miss Marjorie, who hadn't moved an inch. She seemed unaffected by the chaos, as if this was all part of some grim routine. "It was the house," Miss Marjorie said quietly, her eyes never leaving the shattered mirror. "It's always been the house, and now it wants more. It will take what it's owed." Greg's mind was spinning. He had no idea what that meant, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay in this house any longer. Greg held Elizabeth tightly as her trembling subsided, though her breaths came in ragged gasps. She clung to him like a lifeline, her face buried in his shoulder. Emily crouched beside them, her small hands clutching her mother's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We're leaving," Greg said, his voice hoarse but firm. He glared at Miss Marjorie, who stood motionless near the door. "I don't care what this house wants, or what any of this means. We're leaving now." Miss Marjorie's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. "You think it's that simple," she said softly. "You can't just walk away. The house won't let you." Greg ignored her and stood, pulling Elizabeth to her feet. "Come on," he said, his tone brooking no argument. He turned to Emily, his voice softening. "Stay close to me, sweetheart. Don't let go of my hand, okay?" Emily nodded wordlessly, her face pale but determined. Greg led them to the door, his grip tightening on Elizabeth and Emily as he reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so, but it turned without resistance. He opened the door cautiously, half expecting some horrifying apparition to be waiting on the other side. Instead, he found the hallway beyond dim and silent, the flickering sconces casting elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. As they moved through the corridor, the air grew heavier, as though the house itself was aware of their intent to leave. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, the sound echoing ominously in the silence. Greg's grip on his family tightened as he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure from the mirror trailing behind them. But the hallway was empty, at least for now. "We just need to get to the front door," Greg said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Once we're outside, we'll drive to town and never look back." Elizabeth nodded weakly, but her face was pale, her eyes distant. She hadn't spoken since the incident in the library, and Greg worried that the encounter had left her in shock. He squeezed her hand reassuringly, though his own nerves were frayed to the breaking point. As they descended the grand staircase, the temperature dropped again, the chill seeping into their bones. The shadows at the edges of the room seemed to ripple, as if alive, and Greg felt a growing sense of unease. Something was watching them. He was sure of it. "Faster," he urged, quickening his pace. The front door was just ahead, its massive frame looming in the faint light. Relief flooded him as they reached it, and he reached for the doorknob with trembling hands. But the moment his fingers touched the metal, a deafening bang echoed through the mansion, as though something heavy had slammed into the walls. The entire house seemed to shudder, the chandelier above them swaying violently. The lights flickered, plunging them into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. Emily screamed and clung to Elizabeth, who snapped out of her daze and pulled her daughter close. Greg twisted the doorknob desperately, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the door had fused to its frame, an immovable barrier between them and freedom. "No, no, no!" Greg shouted, slamming his shoulder against the door in a futile attempt to force it open. His panic mounted as the banging sound came again, this time closer, reverberating through the walls like the pounding of a massive heart. Elizabeth turned to Miss Marjorie, who had followed them silently down the stairs and now stood a few feet away, her face unreadable. "What's happening?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice shaking. "What is this?" Miss Marjorie tilted her head slightly, her expression one of grim acceptance. "I told you," she said. "The house won't let you leave." Greg rounded on her, his face red with anger and fear. "You knew this would happen," he shouted. "You brought us here, knowing we'd be trapped." "I tried to warn you," Miss Marjorie said calmly, her voice barely audible over the growing noise. "But it's too late now. The house has awakened, and it won't rest until it has what it wants." "And what does it want?" Greg demanded, his voice trembling. Miss Marjorie's gaze shifted to Elizabeth and Emily, her eyes filled with a sorrow that sent a chill down Greg's spine. "It wants you," she said, "the Whitaker bloodline. This house was built on your family's secrets, your family's sins. And now it's come to collect." Elizabeth shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "This isn't happening. This can't be real." The banging grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows began to coalesce, pooling in the corners of the room like liquid darkness. The oppressive presence Greg had felt earlier was now almost suffocating, pressing down on him from all sides. "We need to find another way out," Greg said, his voice tight with determination. "Windows, back doors, anything." But as they turned to flee, the shadows began to shift, rising from the floor like a living tide. The darkness twisted and writhed, taking on monstrous forms that blocked their path. Eyes glinted in the blackness, glowing with an unnatural light, and low, guttural growls echoed through the room. Emily clung to Elizabeth, sobbing, as Greg stood in front of them, his fists clenched. "Stay behind me," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "I'll protect you." Miss Marjorie remained where she was, watching the scene unfold with a strange detachment. "There's no running from it," she said. "The house will get what it's owed. It always does." Greg ignored her, his focus on the shifting shadows that surrounded them. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, a way to save his family. But deep down, he couldn't shake the growing certainty that Miss Marjorie was right. The house had claimed them, and it wasn't going to let them go. Greg's mind raced as the growls deepened, the sound reverberating through the very walls of the mansion. The shadows moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms flickering between shapes, hands, claws, faces twisted in silent agony. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the dim light, and an overwhelming sense of dread began to sink into his bones. Emily whimpered, clutching Elizabeth's skirt as though letting go would mean being swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Elizabeth, pale and trembling, clung to her daughter, her eyes darting around the room, searching desperately for any sign of escape. "We have to move," Greg said through gritted teeth, his voice low but urgent. "I don't care what this house wants. We're getting out." But as he spoke, the darkness began to tighten around them, forming a barrier of writhing shadows that seemed to mock his defiance. The glowing eyes within the shadows blinked in unison, their gaze fixed on the family as though savoring their fear. Greg felt his stomach twist into knots, but he forced himself to remain calm, for Emily, for Elizabeth. He couldn't afford to let them see how terrified he truly was. "Move where, Greg?" Elizabeth's voice was hoarse, her usual composure shattered. "The door won't open, the windows are probably sealed, and..." She gestured to the writhing mass around them. "That thing! Those things won't let us go." "We're not giving up," Greg said firmly, though his hands trembled as he gripped Elizabeth's arm. He turned to Miss Marjorie, who stood eerily still, her face impassive. "You know this place better than anyone. If there's a way out, you need to tell us." "Now." Miss Marjorie's expression didn't change. "There's no true way out," she said, her tone maddeningly calm. "Not while the house still holds its claim. But there may be a delay." "A delay?" Greg snapped. "What the hell does that mean?" "The house feeds on fear and blood," Miss Marjorie explained, her gaze shifting to the shadows that surrounded them. "It craves the life it was promised. But if you can appease it, distract it with something of value, it might give you enough time to..." She was cut off by a loud, bone-shaking bang as one of the massive wooden beams above the foyer splintered and crashed to the ground, sending a plume of dust and debris into the air. Emily screamed, burying her face in Elizabeth's chest, while Greg instinctively shielded them both with his arms. "Enough talking," Greg shouted, his voice cracking. "Just tell us what to do." Miss Marjorie hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her options, before finally speaking. "The basement," she said. "There's an altar there, an old one, built by the Whitakers generations ago. It was meant to bind the house, to keep it sated. If you can rekindle the ritual, it might be enough to hold it back." Greg stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. "A ritual? Are you insane? What kind of? Do you want to live or not?" Miss Marjorie snapped, her voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the chaos. "The house is already closing in. If you don't act now, you won't have another chance." Greg's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He didn't trust Miss Marjorie. She had been cryptic and evasive since the moment they arrived. But as another guttural growl echoed through the room, louder and closer this time, he realized they didn't have any other options. "Fine," he said, his voice hard. "Where's the basement?" Miss Marjorie pointed to a doorway at the far end of the foyer, its frame nearly swallowed by the encroaching shadows. "Through there. The stairs are hidden behind the pantry. But you'll need—" Before she could finish, one of the shadowy figures lunged toward them, its clawed hand swiping through the air with a shriek that made Greg's ears ring. He barely managed to shove Elizabeth and Emily aside as the thing's claws grazed his arm, tearing through his shirt and leaving a burning, icy sensation in their wake. "Go!" Greg shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Run to the door she pointed at." Elizabeth hesitated, her eyes wide with terror. "Greg, just go," he roared, shoving her toward the doorway. "I'll hold them off." Elizabeth grabbed Emily and sprinted toward the pantry, her footsteps echoing in the vast, haunted space. Greg turned back to the shadowy figures, his heart hammering in his chest. The thing that had attacked him was regrouping, its form coiling like a predator preparing to strike again. Miss Marjorie stepped forward, her calm demeanor unshaken. "You can't fight them, you know," she said. "They're not of this world." Greg glared at her. "Then what am I supposed to do?" "Stall them," she said simply, before turning and walking briskly toward the pantry. "We'll need you alive to finish the ritual." Greg cursed under his breath, but didn't argue. He picked up a fallen piece of wood from the shattered beam, gripping it like a makeshift weapon. The shadowy figures hissed and writhed, inching closer, their glowing eyes narrowing. "Come on," Greg muttered, his voice shaking but defiant. "You want me? Here I am." The first figure lunged, its claws slashing through the air, but Greg swung the wood with all his strength, striking it in the chest. The impact sent a shockwave through his arms, and the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek before dissolving into wisps of shadow. For a brief moment, Greg felt a flicker of hope, but then the other figures surged forward, their forms twisting and contorting as they closed in on him. "Greg!" Elizabeth's voice called from the pantry doorway. "Hurry!" Greg turned and ran, the shadows snapping at his heels. He reached the pantry just as Elizabeth pushed the hidden panel open, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase descending into darkness. Miss Marjorie stood at the top of the stairs, holding a small lantern that cast a feeble light. "This way," she said, gesturing for them to follow, "and pray you're ready for what's waiting below." The spiral staircase creaked under their hurried steps, the narrow passageway feeling more suffocating with each descent. The dim lantern in Miss Marjorie's hand cast long, flickering shadows against the stone walls, their shapes shifting unnervingly. Emily clung to Elizabeth, her tiny hands gripping her mother's sweater, as though letting go would mean falling into the encroaching darkness. Greg, clutching his makeshift wooden weapon, glanced behind them constantly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows at the top of the staircase writhed like a living thing, creeping closer with every passing moment. The guttural growls and whispers of the house seemed to echo through the passageway, growing louder as they descended. "Keep moving," Miss Marjorie urged, her tone sharp and urgent. "The basement isn't far." "Not far," Greg snapped, his voice strained. "We've been going down for ages. How deep does this place go?" Miss Marjorie didn't respond, her focus fixed on the steps ahead. Elizabeth, her voice trembling, turned to Greg. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her eyes flicking to the blood-stained tear in his sleeve. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," Greg lied, though the icy burn on his arm had spread, numbing his fingers. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to ignore the pain. "We just need to get this over with." As they reached the bottom of the staircase, the air grew damp and heavy, carrying the faint, acrid scent of mildew and decay. The lantern's light revealed a vast stone chamber, its walls lined with faded, crumbling symbols etched into the stone. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly in the stillness. In the center of the chamber stood an altar made of black, polished stone, its surface etched with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Surrounding the altar were tall iron candelabras, their wax-dripped surfaces holding half-burnt black candles. "This is it," Miss Marjorie said, her voice low as she stepped forward, holding the lantern higher to illuminate the altar. "The heart of the house, the source of its power." Greg stared at the altar, his stomach twisting with unease. The carvings seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light, as though alive, and the air around it felt charged with an unnatural energy. What do we do?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marjorie turned to them, her expression grim. "The Whitaker family built this altar generations ago to appease the house. They offered blood, sacrifices, to keep the darkness contained. But over time, the rituals were abandoned, the bloodline thinned, and the house grew restless." Greg's jaw tightened. "So you're saying this thing wants a sacrifice? That's insane." "It doesn't have to be a life," Miss Marjorie said quickly, though her tone was uncertain. "A symbolic offering might be enough, something meaningful, something tied to the family." Greg felt a surge of anger. "Why didn't you mention any of this before? We could have brought something from upstairs." "You didn't have time," Miss Marjorie snapped. "And besides, the house would have taken it anyway. It doesn't play by our rules, Mr. Whitaker. It never has." Elizabeth's voice broke through their argument, trembling but resolute. "We don't have anything. What do we do now?" Miss Marjorie hesitated, her gaze flicking to the altar. "There's one other way," she said softly. "Blood. The house will accept Whitaker blood." Greg's heart sank, and he stepped protectively in front of Elizabeth and Emily. "No, absolutely not. It doesn't have to be fatal," Miss Marjorie said quickly. "A small offering, a cut, a drop of blood. It might be enough to placate it, to buy you time to escape. And if it's not enough?" Greg demanded, his voice rising. "What then?" Miss Marjorie didn't answer, her silence saying more than words ever could. Emily clung to Elizabeth, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy, I'm scared," she whispered. "I don't want to do this." Elizabeth knelt down, holding Emily tightly. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, though her voice trembled. "We're going to get through this. I promise." Greg turned back to the altar, his mind racing. He hated the idea of giving the house anything, let alone his blood, but they were out of options. The shadows were closing in, the growls growing louder, and the oppressive presence of the house seemed to press down on them from all sides. "Fine," he said finally, his voice hard. "If this is what it takes to get my family out of here, I'll do it." Elizabeth's eyes widened. Greg, no. It has to be me, Greg said firmly. I'm not letting this thing touch you or Emily. Miss Marjorie stepped forward, pulling a small, ceremonial dagger from within her coat. The blade was tarnished and old, its edge gleaming faintly in the lantern light. She held it out to Greg, her expression solemn. "Make it quick," she said, and placed the blood directly on the altar. Greg took the dagger with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the blade felt wrong, as though it carried the weight of every terrible thing that had ever happened in the house. He glanced at Elizabeth, who was clutching Emily tightly, her face pale and stricken. "I'll be fine," he said, trying to reassure her. "I just need you to be ready to run when this is over." Greg turned to the altar, gripping the dagger tightly. The carvings on the stone seemed to pulse more rapidly as he approached, as though the house itself was anticipating his offering. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the blade to his palm and made a shallow cut, wincing as the pain flared. A single drop of blood fell onto the altar, and the room seemed to shudder. The air grew colder, the shadows recoiling slightly as a deep, guttural sound echoed through the chamber. For a moment, Greg thought it had worked. But then the sound grew louder, and the shadows surged forward once more, their forms twisting into something far more monstrous. Miss Marjorie's face went pale. "It's not enough," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's waking up." The ground beneath their feet trembled, a low, resonant hum filling the air as if the house itself were drawing breath. The carvings on the altar glowed brighter, their unnatural luminescence casting eerie patterns on the walls. The sound of deep, guttural chanting began to rise, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Greg stumbled back, clutching his bleeding hand. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked at Miss Marjorie. "What do you mean it's not enough? You said this would work." "I said it might work," Miss Marjorie shouted, her voice rising in panic. "The house, it's more powerful than I realized. It's been starved for too long. A drop of blood isn't going to satisfy it." Elizabeth clutched Emily tightly, her gaze darting between Greg and the encroaching darkness. "Then what will satisfy it?" she demanded. "Tell us what to do." Miss Marjorie hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "It wants more," she said finally. "More blood. More life. It wants the family to finish what the Whitakers started." "No," Greg said, shaking his head. "No, we're not doing this. There has to be another way." But even as he spoke, the shadows around them began to take shape. They were no longer just flickering forms in the darkness. They were becoming solid, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and twisted, grotesque faces. Their glowing eyes burned with a malevolent light, and their mouths opened in silent screams. One of the figures stepped forward, its clawed hand reaching out toward Emily. The little girl screamed, burying her face in Elizabeth's chest. "Stay away from her," Greg roared, stepping between them and swinging his wooden weapon. The shadow recoiled, hissing angrily, but it didn't retreat far. "They're stalling," Miss Marjorie said, her voice trembling. "They're waiting for the house to decide. If it chooses to claim you all, there's nothing we can do." "No!" Elizabeth shouted. "We're not going to let that happen." She turned to Greg, desperation in her eyes. "What if we destroy the altar? Would that stop it?" Miss Marjorie shook her head. "The altar isn't just a physical object, it's a conduit. Destroying it might sever the connection, but it could also release whatever's bound here completely. It's too dangerous to risk." Greg's mind raced as the chanting grew louder, the sound drilling into his skull. He could feel the house pressing down on him, its hunger a palpable force in the air. He glanced at Emily, her tear-streaked face buried in Elizabeth's shoulder, and he knew he couldn't let her suffer for the sins of their ancestors. "What about me?" he said suddenly, his voice firm. If it wants Whitaker blood, then take me. Leave them out of this. Elizabeth's eyes widened in horror. Greg, no. It's the only way, he said, his voice breaking. I won't let it take Emily. I won't let it take you. Miss Marjorie stepped closer, her expression grim. If you offer yourself willingly, it might accept. But once you do, there's no going back. Greg nodded, his jaw tightening. I don't care. Just promise me you'll get them out of here. No! Elizabeth screamed, grabbing his arm. You can't do this. We'll find another way. There is no other way. Greg shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his gaze locking with hers. You need to protect Emily. You need to get her out of here and keep her safe. That's all that matters. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face as she shook her head, her hands clutching his shirt. I can't do this without you, she whispered. You have to, Greg said softly. He kissed her forehead, then knelt down to Emily, who was sobbing quietly. Hey, sweetheart, he said, forcing a smile. You're going to be okay. Mommy's going to take care of you. Emily shook her head, her tiny fists gripping his shirt. Don't go, Daddy. Please don't go. Greg's heart felt like it was being ripped in half, but he forced himself to stay strong. I'll always be with you, he said, his voice trembling. I promise. He stood and turned to Miss Marjorie. Tell me what to do. Miss Marjorie hesitated, then nodded. She stepped toward the altar, her hands trembling as she placed the lantern on its surface. Kneel before the altar, she said. Place your hands on it and speak these words. I give myself willingly to the house, to sate its hunger and seal its power. Greg swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at Elizabeth one last time, then stepped toward the altar. The carvings seemed to pulse faster as he approached, the light from the lantern casting his shadow long and distorted across the chamber. Greg! Elizabeth cried, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. If he did, he might lose his resolve. He knelt before the altar, his hands shaking as he placed them on the cold, polished stone. The carvings felt alive beneath his palms, their energy thrumming like a heartbeat. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to speak. I give myself willingly to the house, to sate its hunger and seal its power. The moment the words left his lips, the room erupted in chaos. The chanting grew deafening, the shadows surging forward with a collective shriek. The carvings on the altar glowed brighter than ever, their light blinding. Greg felt a searing pain shoot through his body, as though the house were draining the very essence of his being. Elizabeth screamed his name, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony. The last thing Greg saw before the darkness consumed him was Emily's tear-streaked face, her tiny hand reaching out for him. And then, everything went silent. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the house itself had drawn in a deep breath and was holding it, waiting. The glow from the altar faded, leaving only the flickering lantern light to illuminate the chamber. Greg was gone. The place where he had knelt was empty, the stone surface now cold and lifeless. Elizabeth clutched Emily tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt frozen in place, her knees trembling as her mind struggled to process what had just happened. The shadows that had been advancing now seemed to hesitate, their twisted forms flickering uncertainly. Miss Marjorie, Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Did it work? Miss Marjorie stared at the altar, her expression grim and unreadable. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. The house should be appeased. It should let us go. Elizabeth's gaze darted to the shadows. They were no longer advancing, but they hadn't disappeared either. Their glowing eyes remained fixed on her and Emily, unblinking and malevolent. Then why aren't they gone? Elizabeth demanded, her voice rising in panic. Why are they still here? Before Miss Marjorie could answer, the ground began to tremble again. A low, guttural sound emanated from the walls, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very foundation of the house. The carvings on the altar flared to life once more, their glow pulsating erratically. "No," Miss Marjorie whispered, her face going pale. "It's not enough. The house, it's still hungry." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Greg gave himself willingly. He did what it wanted. Miss Marjorie shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "The house doesn't just take. It consumes. And once it starts, it doesn't stop." Emily whimpered, burying her face in Elizabeth's shoulder. "Mommy, I'm scared." Elizabeth held her daughter tightly, her mind racing. They had come so far, sacrificed so much, and it still wasn't enough. The house's insatiable hunger was a force beyond comprehension, a black hole that devoured everything in its path. "We have to get out of here," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling but determined. "Now." Miss Marjorie hesitated, her gaze flicking to the altar. "The way out isn't as simple as going back up the stairs," she said. "The house won't let us leave unless it's satisfied. Then we'll make it let us leave," Elizabeth snapped. "I'm not sacrificing anyone else." The shadows began to move again, creeping closer with every passing second. Their forms twisted and writhed, their shapes barely human anymore. The air grew colder, and Elizabeth could feel the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on her, a malevolent force that seemed to seep into her very bones. Miss Marjorie grabbed the lantern and turned to Elizabeth. "Follow me," she said. "There's another way, a final way. But it's dangerous." Elizabeth didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." Miss Marjorie led them to the far end of the chamber, where a narrow passageway was concealed behind a crumbling section of the wall. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and the darkness beyond it was impenetrable. "This passage leads to the heart of the house," Miss Marjorie explained. "The source of its power. If we can destroy it, we might be able to break its hold." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "And if we can't?" Miss Marjorie's expression darkened. "Then we won't be leaving." Without another word, Elizabeth pushed Emily ahead of her into the passage, her heart pounding as they squeezed through the narrow opening. The air inside was damp and foul, carrying the scent of rot and decay. The walls were lined with strange, organic growths that pulsed faintly as if alive. "Stay close," Miss Marjorie warned, her voice echoing in the confined space. "And whatever you do, don't stop." The passage twisted and turned, its walls closing in as though the house itself were trying to crush them. The sound of the chanting grew louder, echoing through the darkness like a sinister hymn. Elizabeth kept her focus on Emily, who stumbled ahead of her, clutching her mother's hand tightly. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a cavernous chamber. The space was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness. In the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating structure, its surface covered in the same glowing carvings as the altar. The air around it was thick with an oppressive energy, making it difficult to breathe. "This is it," Miss Marjorie said, her voice barely audible. "The heart of the house." Elizabeth stared at the structure, a sense of dread washing over her. It was alive. She could feel its malevolent presence, its insatiable hunger. The chanting was deafening now, reverberating through the chamber like a physical force. "What do we do?" Elizabeth asked, her voice shaking. Miss Marjorie hesitated, then pulled a small vial of clear liquid from her coat. "This is consecrated oil," she explained. "If we can get it onto the heart, it should disrupt its power. But we'll have to get close." Elizabeth nodded, her determination hardening. "Then let's do it." Miss Marjorie handed her the vial. "I'll distract the shadows," she said. "You get to the heart. Whatever happens, don't stop until it's done." Elizabeth hesitated, glancing at Emily. "Stay with her," she told Miss Marjorie. "Don't let anything happen to her." "I will," Miss Marjorie promised. "Now go." Elizabeth took the vial and sprinted toward the pulsating structure, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows surged toward her, their forms twisting and shifting as they tried to block her path. She dodged and weaved, clutching the vial tightly in her hand. Behind her, Miss Marjorie shouted, drawing the shadows' attention. The old woman swung the lantern wildly, its light casting erratic beams across the chamber. "Over here," she yelled. "Come and get me." The shadows hesitated, then turned toward Miss Marjorie, their glowing eyes narrowing. Elizabeth seized the opportunity and lunged forward, reaching the base of the structure. The carvings on its surface writhed and pulsed, as though alive. She uncorked the vial, her hands trembling, and poured the oil onto the heart. The liquid hissed and bubbled as it made contact, and the structure let out a deafening roar. The carvings flared brightly, then began to crack and splinter. The entire house shuddered violently, the walls groaning as if in agony. Elizabeth stumbled back, shielding her face from the blinding light that erupted from the heart. The light from the shattered heart consumed the chamber, bathing everything in an unnatural, searing brightness. Elizabeth stumbled backward, shielding Emily with her body as the ground beneath them heaved violently. The sound of the house's groans and shrieks was deafening, a cacophony that felt as though the very walls were alive and screaming. Miss Marjorie's voice cut through the chaos. "Get back to the passageway. Now." Elizabeth grabbed Emily's hand and ran, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The shadows were no longer chasing them. Instead, they writhed and twisted in apparent agony, their forms flickering and distorting. As the light from the heart grew brighter, the shadows began to dissolve, their anguished cries echoing through the chamber. "Mommy, I'm scared," Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. "I know, sweetheart, I know," Elizabeth panted, pulling her daughter along. "We're almost out. Just keep going." Miss Marjorie brought up the rear, her lantern swinging wildly in her hand. The old woman looked back at the pulsating heart, which was now cracking apart, dark smoke pouring from its fractures. The house trembled again, more violently this time, and large chunks of the ceiling began to collapse. "This whole place is coming down," Miss Marjorie shouted. "Move faster." Elizabeth and Emily squeezed back into the narrow passageway, the walls trembling as dust and debris rained down around them. The air was thick with the stench of burning and rot, making it difficult to breathe. Behind them, the chamber was a maelstrom of light and shadow, the heart's destruction sending shockwaves through the house. "Don't stop," Elizabeth urged Emily, her voice strained. "Just keep moving." The passageway seemed endless, twisting and turning as though the house itself was trying to trap them. Elizabeth's lungs burned, and her legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but she pushed forward, driven by sheer determination to protect her daughter. Finally, they emerged back into the basement. The room looked different now, warped and distorted as if reality itself was unraveling. The walls bulged and twisted, and the air shimmered with an otherworldly glow. The shadows that had plagued them earlier were gone, but the sense of impending doom was stronger than ever. "Where's the way out?" Elizabeth demanded, spinning around to face Miss Marjorie. The old woman pointed toward the stairs. "That's our only chance," she said. "We need to get above ground before the house collapses completely." Elizabeth nodded and scooped Emily into her arms. The little girl clung to her neck, her face buried in her mother's shoulder. Together, they ran toward the stairs, Mississippi Marjorie close behind. As they ascended, the house seemed to fight back. The steps warped and splintered beneath their feet, forcing them to leap over gaping holes. The walls groaned and buckled, and Elizabeth could feel the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on her, as though it were trying to crush her. "We're almost there," Miss Marjorie shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise. They reached the ground floor, but the sight that greeted them was nothing short of horrifying. The once grand foyer was now a nightmarish landscape of shifting shadows and collapsing walls. The chandelier that had once hung elegantly from the ceiling now dangled precariously, its crystals shattering as the house continued to quake. Elizabeth spotted the front door, or what was left of it, hanging crookedly on its hinges. A faint glow of moonlight seeped through the cracks, a beacon of hope in the chaos. "There!" she cried, sprinting toward the door. Miss Marjorie followed, her breathing labored. The floor buckled and cracked beneath their feet, but they managed to reach the door just as a deafening roar shook the house. Elizabeth shoved the door open with all her strength, and they stumbled out onto the front lawn, the cool night air hitting them like a wave. For a moment, everything was still. The house loomed behind them, its windows glowing with an eerie light. The sound of creaking wood and shifting stone filled the air as the structure seemed to implode upon itself. The light from the shattered heart burst through the windows, illuminating the night like a second sun. Elizabeth and Emily collapsed onto the grass, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. Miss Marjorie fell to her knees beside them, clutching her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. The house let out one final, earth-shaking roar before it collapsed inward, the walls folding in on themselves as if consumed by an invisible force. A plume of dust and smoke rose into the air, and then silence. Elizabeth stared at the smoldering ruins, her mind numb. She held Emily tightly, tears streaming down her face. It was over. The house was gone, but the sense of relief was short-lived. From the pile of rubble, a faint glow began to emerge. It was dim at first, barely noticeable, but it grew brighter with each passing second. Elizabeth's heart sank as she realized the truth. The house wasn't finished with them. Miss Marjorie's voice was a hoarse whisper. "It's not over. It's never over." Elizabeth turned to her, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" "The house," Miss Marjorie said, her gaze fixed on the glowing ruins. "It's alive, and it always comes back." The faint glow emanating from the ruins pulsed rhythmically, casting an eerie light over the lawn. Elizabeth tightened her grip on Emily, who whimpered softly, too exhausted to cry any longer. The oppressive silence that followed the house's collapse felt even more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. "What do you mean it comes back?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice trembling. "It's gone. We destroyed it." Miss Marjorie slowly pushed herself to her feet, her gaze never leaving the glowing ruins. "You can destroy the vessel, but the entity, the thing that powers it, it's ancient. It's not bound by wood and stone. It will find another way." Elizabeth shook her head, her mind refusing to accept the old woman's words. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not going back. I won't let it take us." Miss Marjorie's face was lined with despair. "It doesn't matter where you go. Once it's chosen you, it won't stop. It's bound to your blood now, Elizabeth." Elizabeth staggered back as though the words had struck her physically. Her mind reeled with the implications. The sacrifices, the rituals, the destruction of the heart, it had all been for nothing. The house had marked her, and by extension, Emily. "There has to be something we can do," Elizabeth said desperately. "Some way to break the connection." Miss Marjorie hesitated, her expression conflicted. "There's one possibility," she said finally, her voice heavy with reluctance. "But it's dangerous. More dangerous than anything we've done so far." Elizabeth's gaze locked onto the older woman. "Tell me." Miss Marjorie glanced at Emily, then back at Elizabeth. "It requires confronting the entity directly. binding it and forcing it into submission. But it's a ritual older than any I've ever known. And if we fail, she trailed off, her meaning clear. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. If we do nothing, it will take us anyway. I'd rather fight. Miss Marjorie nodded grimly. Very well, but we need to act quickly. The entity will grow stronger now that it's free from the house. If we wait too long, we won't stand a chance. She turned toward the ruins, her silhouette framed by the faint glow. The first step is to gather what's left of its power, she said. We'll need to use the remnants of the heart to create a binding circle. It's the only way to contain it. Elizabeth hesitated, her eyes flicking to Emily. What about her? She asked. I can't risk her getting hurt. Miss Marjorie's expression softened. She'll need to stay with us. The entity is already tied to her. Separating her now would only make things worse. Elizabeth swallowed hard, her stomach churning with fear. All right, she said finally. What do we do? Miss Marjorie began to explain the steps of the ritual, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. They would need to create a circle of protection around the glowing remnants, using salt and ash from the destroyed house. The binding spell required symbols drawn in blood, Elizabeth's blood, as the one marked by the entity. Elizabeth listened intently, her mind racing. She couldn't allow herself to falter, not now. Emily depended on her. Together, they began to work, gathering the necessary materials from the ruins. The glowing remnants of the heart pulsed faintly, as if aware of their presence. Elizabeth shivered, the air around it unnaturally cold despite the summer night. Miss Marjorie handed her a small knife. You'll need to cut your palm, she said. Use the blood to draw the sigils around the circle. Elizabeth hesitated, her hand trembling. Then she took a deep breath and pressed the blade to her palm, wincing as the skin split. Blood welled up, warm and sticky, and she quickly began to draw the symbols as Miss Marjorie instructed. Emily clung to her side, her wide eyes filled with fear. Mommy, is it going to hurt us? She whispered. Elizabeth forced a reassuring smile, even though her heart was pounding. No, sweetheart. I won't let it. Just stay close to me, okay? Emily nodded, her small hands clutching Elizabeth's sleeve. As the final symbol was drawn, the air around them seemed to shift. The glow from the remnants grew brighter, and the oppressive presence of the entity became palpable, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Miss Marjorie stepped into the circle, holding a book of ancient texts. She began to chant, her voice strong and unwavering. The words were incomprehensible, a language long forgotten by time, but their power was undeniable. The ground beneath them trembled, and the glow from the remnants flared, casting eerie shadows across the lawn. Suddenly, a deafening roar erupted from the ruins, and a massive, shadowy form began to rise. It was shapeless and ever-changing, its edges flickering like smoke. Eyes, dozens of them, opened within the darkness, glowing with an otherworldly light. Stay in the circle, Miss Marjorie shouted. Whatever happens, don't step out. Elizabeth pulled Emily close, her heart racing as the shadowy form loomed over them. The entity let out another roar, its voice echoing through the night like 1,000 tortured souls. The binding ritual had begun. The entity's shadow expanded outward, blotting out the moonlight and plunging the world into an unnatural darkness. Its many eyes blinked in unison, their gaze fixed on the circle where Elizabeth, Emily, and Miss Marjorie stood. The oppressive weight of its presence grew heavier, suffocating in its intensity. Miss Marjorie's chanting grew louder, her voice cutting through the entity's guttural roars. The symbols drawn in blood around the circle began to glow, their light a stark contrast to the darkness pressing in on them. The air crackled with energy, the clash of opposing forces sending waves of heat and cold rippling through the space. "Elizabeth, hold on to Emily," Miss Marjorie commanded, her eyes never leaving the shadowy form. "Whatever it does, don't let go." Elizabeth wrapped her arms tightly around Emily, who buried her face in her mother's chest, trembling violently. Elizabeth's own fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't let her terror take hold. Not now. The entity let out a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the ground. Its form began to shift, tendrils of shadow reaching out toward the circle. As one of the tendrils brushed against the edge of the glowing symbols, a burst of light erupted, forcing it back with an inhuman screech. "It's testing the boundaries," Miss Marjorie said, her voice strained. "We have to strengthen the circle. Elizabeth, take Emily and step closer to the center." Elizabeth obeyed, pulling Emily with her. The moment they moved, the shadows surged forward again, hammering against the edges of the circle. Sparks of light shot upward with each impact, illuminating the entity's grotesque, ever-changing form. Its eyes glowed brighter, filled with a malevolent intelligence. Miss Marjorie reached into her bag and pulled out a handful of salt, which she scattered along the edges of the circle. "Hold fast," she shouted. "It's trying to break through." The chanting grew louder, each word reverberating with power. The air inside the circle became unbearably hot, while outside, an icy chill descended. Elizabeth could feel the energy coursing through her, pulling at her blood like a tide. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that the entity was drawing on her connection to it, trying to weaken her resolve. "Fight it!" Miss Marjorie called out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the entity. "It's feeding on your fear." Elizabeth clenched her teeth, forcing herself to take deep, steady breaths. She focused on Emily, her small, fragile form trembling in her arms. "It's going to be okay, baby," she whispered, though her voice cracked with the effort to sound convincing. "I promise." The entity let out a deafening roar, and the ground beneath them split open, revealing a chasm filled with swirling shadows. From the depths, more tendrils emerged, writhing and clawing at the edges of the circle. Miss Marjorie threw another handful of salt, but her movements were slower now, her strength waning. Elizabeth's heart sank. She could see the strain on Miss Marjorie's face, the sweat pouring down her temples. The old woman was giving everything she had, but it wasn't enough. The entity was too powerful. "Miss Marjorie," Elizabeth called out. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" The old woman turned to her, her expression grim. "The binding isn't enough. We need to force it back into the remnants of the heart. It's the only way to contain it." Elizabeth's mind raced. The glowing fragments of the heart were scattered across the ruins, their light faint and flickering. "How do we do that?" Miss Marjorie hesitated, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw fear in her eyes. "It requires a sacrifice," she said quietly. "A piece of the one it's bound to." Elizabeth froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What? What kind of piece?" "Blood, flesh, a part of your essence," Miss Marjorie said, her voice heavy with regret. "It has to be willingly given. And it has to be you, Elizabeth. You're the one it's marked." Elizabeth's stomach churned. The very idea filled her with dread, but the alternative was unthinkable. She looked down at Emily, who clung to her tightly, her innocent eyes filled with trust and fear. "Mommy," Emily whispered. "What's happening?" Elizabeth pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "Everything's going to be okay," she said, though her voice shook. Turning back to Miss Marjorie, she nodded. "Tell me what to do." Miss Marjorie's face softened with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "You'll need to cut deeply," she said. "Enough to leave a part of yourself behind. The blood and flesh will serve as an anchor, drawing the entity back into the remnants." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she took the knife Miss Marjorie handed her. The blade gleamed in the dim light, its edge razor-sharp. She could feel Emily's eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at her daughter. If she did, she might lose her nerve. With a deep breath, Elizabeth placed the blade against her forearm. The cold metal bit into her skin, and she pressed down, gritting her teeth against the pain. Blood welled up immediately, dripping onto the ground. She winced as she cut deeper, slicing away a small piece of flesh. The moment the piece of her essence fell into the circle, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The entity let out a bone-chilling scream, its shadowy form convulsing. The glowing remnants of the heart flared to life, their light piercing through the darkness. "It's working," Miss Marjorie shouted. "Hold on just a little longer." Elizabeth clutched her bleeding arm, her vision swimming with pain and exhaustion. She watched as the entity's tendrils began to retract, drawn toward the glowing fragments like iron filings to a magnet. The shadowy form writhed and shrank, its many eyes closing one by one. The ritual was far from over, but the tides were beginning to turn. The entity's form began collapsing in on itself, the massive shadow shrinking as it was drawn toward the glowing remnants of the heart. Its guttural screams reverberated through the night, a haunting symphony of rage and despair. The oppressive darkness that had swallowed the area started to recede, replaced by the harsh glow of the ritual. Elizabeth's arm throbbed with pain, blood streaming down her hand and pooling at her feet. She could feel her strength waning, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. But she couldn't falter now, not when they were so close. "Stay strong," Miss Marjorie shouted over the cacophony, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "The entity is resisting. We have to seal it before it can escape again." Elizabeth nodded weakly, clutching Emily tighter against her side. The little girl's wide eyes were fixed on the swirling shadows, her small body trembling like a leaf. "You're doing so good, baby," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're gonna get through this. I promise." The entity let out a final, earth-shaking roar as its form was pulled violently into the glowing fragments. The tendrils of shadow writhed and twisted, clawing at the edges of the circle as though seeking a way out. But the protective barrier held firm, the glowing symbols pulsing with renewed energy. Miss Marjorie raised her hands, her chanting reaching a fever pitch. The ancient words rolled off her tongue with a power that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. The fragments of the heart flared brighter, their light merging into a single, blinding pulse that consumed the shadows entirely. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The shadows vanished, the roaring stopped, and the oppressive presence lifted. The glowing fragments of the heart dimmed and faded, leaving only silence in their wake. For a moment, no one moved. The three of them stood frozen in the circle, the stillness almost more unnerving than the chaos that had preceded it. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest, her breathing ragged as she clutched Emily tightly. Is it over?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marjorie lowered her hands, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "It's contained," she said, her voice hoarse. "For now." Elizabeth's knees finally gave out, and she sank to the ground, pulling Emily into her lap. The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, her small body trembling as she buried her face in Elizabeth's shoulder. "You did it, Mommy," Emily whispered, her voice muffled. "You saved us." Elizabeth stroked her daughter's hair, tears streaming down her face. "We're safe now," she said, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, she knew their ordeal wasn't truly over. Miss Marjorie knelt beside them, her expression grave. "You've bought yourself some time," she said, "but this isn't the end. The entity is contained, but it's not destroyed. It never can be." Elizabeth looked at her, her eyes filled with exhaustion and despair. "Then what was the point of all this?" she demanded. "If it's not over, then why did we go through all of this?" Miss Marjorie placed a hand on her shoulder. "Because every moment you can keep it contained is a moment you and Emily can live without its influence," she said gently. "And that's worth fighting for." Elizabeth nodded slowly, though her heart ached with the weight of the truth. She glanced at the ruins of the house, now little more than smoldering rubble. The glowing remnants of the heart had vanished completely, leaving behind only darkness. "What happens now?" she asked. Miss Marjorie sighed, rising to her feet. "Now we prepare. The entity is bound to you, Elizabeth. As long as you live, it will never stop trying to break free. But there are ways to keep it at bay, rituals, wards, protections. It won't be easy, but you're not alone." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to feel relief, but all she felt was exhaustion and an overwhelming sense of dread. She looked down at Emily, who had fallen into an uneasy sleep in her arms. For her sake, Elizabeth knew she had to keep fighting, no matter how impossible it seemed. Miss Marjorie offered her hand. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's get away from here." Elizabeth hesitated, glancing at the ruins one last time. The weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her, but she knew she couldn't stay. With a deep breath, she took Miss Marjorie's hand and rose to her feet, holding Emily tightly against her chest. As they walked away from the ruins, the wind carried with it a faint whisper, almost imperceptible. Elizabeth froze, her blood running cold as the words reached her ears. "I'll be waiting." She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. Only the smoldering ruins and the empty night. Miss Marjorie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's just the wind," she said, though her expression betrayed her unease. "Don't let it get to you." Elizabeth nodded, though her heart pounded with fear. She knew the truth. The entity wasn't gone. It was simply biding its time, and it would wait as long as it needed. As the trio moved further from the ruins, the oppressive aura seemed to dissipate, replaced by a haunting stillness. Elizabeth kept Emily close, her arm aching from the wound she had inflicted during the ritual. Miss Marjorie led the way, her steps slow and deliberate, as though she were burdened by something heavier than exhaustion. "Where are we going?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low. The distant echo of the entity's final roar still rang in her ears. "There's a safe house," Miss Marjorie replied, "a place steeped in protective wards. It's where we'll regroup and figure out how to keep the entity contained." Elizabeth hesitated. "And if it finds us there?" "It won't," Miss Marjorie said, though her tone lacked conviction. "The wards are old and powerful, designed to mask your presence from it. For now, we'll be safe." Emily stirred in Elizabeth's arms, her small voice breaking the tense silence. "Mommy, is the scary thing gone?" Elizabeth kissed her daughter's forehead, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Yes, sweetheart. It's gone. We're safe now." But the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. The safe house was a small, unassuming cabin nestled deep in the woods, its weathered exterior hidden beneath a canopy of ancient trees. Miss Marjorie stopped at the edge of the clearing, raising a hand as if to feel the air around her. After a moment, she nodded and gestured for Elizabeth to follow. "Stay close," she said. "The wards are strongest inside." Elizabeth stepped into the clearing, her footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. The air felt different here, heavier, but not in the oppressive way she had experienced with the entity. It was more like a dense, invisible blanket, protective and impenetrable. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A single room housed a modest kitchen, a table with mismatched chairs, and a cot in one corner. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with dusty tomes, jars of herbs, and an assortment of strange objects Elizabeth couldn't identify. Miss Marjorie lit a few candles, their warm glow casting flickering shadows across the room. She motioned for Elizabeth to set Emily on the cot. "She needs rest," the older woman said. "And so do you." Elizabeth laid Emily down gently, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. The little girl's breathing was steady, her exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. For a brief moment, Elizabeth felt a pang of relief, but it was fleeting. Miss Marjorie handed Elizabeth a clean cloth and a small vial of ointment. "For your arm," she said. "You'll need to keep it clean. The entity's influence can linger in wounds like that." Elizabeth took the supplies with a shaky nod. "What did you mean earlier about preparing? How do we keep it from coming back?" Miss Marjorie sank into one of the chairs, her expression weary. "The entity is bound to your bloodline now, Elizabeth. It's drawn to your essence, your memories, your fears. The binding ritual was a temporary measure. The only way to truly keep it at bay is to starve it." "Starve it?" Elizabeth echoed, confused. Miss Marjorie nodded. "It feeds on fear, despair, and pain. The stronger those emotions, the more power it gains. That's why it marked you and Emily. It saw the cracks in your family, the grief and guilt you carry. It thrives on that." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "So what do we do? Pretend everything is fine and hope it loses interest?" Miss Marjorie gave a grim smile. "Not pretend. Heal. Find ways to rebuild your strength, your bond with Emily. The entity will try to manipulate you, to dredge up old wounds and create new ones. But if you can resist, if you can refuse to give it what it wants, it will weaken." Elizabeth slumped into a chair, her mind reeling. The thought of facing the entity's insidious influence day after day was overwhelming. She had barely survived tonight. How could she possibly endure a lifetime of this? "You won't be alone," Miss Marjorie said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'll help you. There are others like me, people who've fought these things before. We'll teach you how to protect yourself and Emily." Elizabeth looked at her, searching for reassurance in the older woman's tired eyes. "Have you ever seen anyone win? Really win?" Miss Marjorie hesitated, and Elizabeth's heart sank. But then the old woman's expression softened. "It's not about winning," she said gently. "It's about surviving. And as long as you're still fighting, the entity hasn't won either." The words offered little comfort, but Elizabeth clung to them nonetheless. For Emily's sake, she had to keep fighting. Later, as the cabin settled into uneasy silence, Elizabeth sat by the cot, watching her daughter sleep. Her mind drifted back to the ruins of the house, the glowing fragments of the heart, and the entity's final whisper, "I'll be waiting." A shiver ran down her spine. She didn't know how long they had bought themselves, or what the future held. But one thing was certain, the fight was far from over, and the entity was patient. The days following the ritual passed in a blur, each one blending into the next as Elizabeth and Emily settled into the cabin. The weight of what they had survived hung over them like an oppressive fog, neither of them truly able to relax. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, made Elizabeth's heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even when they were alone. Miss Marjorie stayed close, offering what guidance she could. The older woman's presence was a comfort, but Elizabeth couldn't ignore the constant undercurrent of tension in the air. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same grim truth. The entity was still out there, bound but not destroyed, waiting for the moment when it could break free again. Each morning, Miss Marjorie would go over protective rituals, teaching Elizabeth the basics of warding and binding. They would scatter salt around the perimeter of the cabin, draw protective symbols on the walls, and repeat the ancient chants that Miss Marjorie had learned over a lifetime. It was exhausting work, and Elizabeth could feel the toll it was taking on her body and mind. She hadn't been trained for any of this. She was just a mother trying to protect her daughter from an unimaginable horror. Emily was quiet during the days, spending most of her time curled up on the cot with her stuffed animals, her eyes wide and watchful. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice held an unfamiliar distance, as if the events of the past days had taken something from her that she couldn't quite name. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cabin in long shadows, Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. A sense of unease had settled in her chest. Something wasn't right. The air felt thick, charged with a static energy that she couldn't place. "Miss Marjorie?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. "What happens if it gets too strong? If we can't keep it away?" The old woman paused in her quiet work at the table, her eyes narrowing as she studied Elizabeth. "There are places where the entity can become stronger," she said slowly. "Places where the boundaries between this world and its world are thinner. If it finds one of those places..." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "It can break through?" Miss Marjorie nodded. "Yes, it can slip past the wards, slip past the bindings. And once it's free, it won't stop until it's consumed everything in its path." Elizabeth swallowed hard. "How do we stop it then?" The older woman looked away, her face etched with sorrow. "You don't. You can't. Not completely." Elizabeth felt the walls of the cabin close in around her. The very idea that there was no escape, no way to stop this thing for good, made her feel trapped. She had thought that they had gained some time, but now it seemed like the clock was ticking faster than ever before. Suddenly, Emily stirred from her cot, her eyes wide and panicked. "Mommy, it's coming," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. "I can hear it." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she rushed to her daughter's side. Emily was trembling, her little body rigid with terror. The room seemed to grow colder, the very air thick with a heavy, foreboding presence. Miss Marjorie stood, her face tight with concentration. "It's here," she muttered, moving toward the door. "Quickly, Elizabeth. Get the salt. Draw the symbols." Elizabeth's hands shook as she scrambled to gather the salt and chalk. Her heart hammered in her chest, her thoughts racing. How could it have found them so soon? Emily clung to her mother, her small voice trembling. "Mommy, I'm scared. It's in the trees." Elizabeth's eyes snapped to the window. The trees outside swayed, though the wind had died down. There was something wrong about the way they moved, something unnatural. "Stay here," Elizabeth told Emily, her voice firm but shaking. She turned to Miss Marjorie, who was already standing near the door, murmuring an incantation under her breath. "Miss Marjorie, what's happening?" Elizabeth asked, panic creeping into her voice. "How do we stop it?" The old woman's face was tight with concentration as she pressed her palm against the doorframe, her eyes closed in concentration. "It's not just a shadow anymore," she murmured. "It's become something else, something more." Elizabeth's blood ran cold as the door creaked. Slowly, she moved toward it, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The room seemed to warp around her, the shadows deepening and stretching, as if the darkness itself were alive. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. As she turned the handle, the door swung open with a soft, almost mocking groan. Outside, the world had changed. The trees were no longer just trees. Their twisted forms loomed tall and unnaturally still, their bark like cracked stone, their limbs like long, skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The air was thick with the scent of decay. The earth beneath her feet seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing. And in the distance, in the shadows beyond the trees, Elizabeth saw it, the entity. It was no longer confined to the realm of shadows. It had taken on a physical form, one that stretched and shifted like liquid darkness, its many eyes blinking and gleaming in the gloom. It was watching them, its presence an overwhelming weight that pressed against Elizabeth's chest. "Elizabeth," Miss Marjorie's voice was barely a whisper. "Close the door. Now." Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She slammed the door shut, the heavy thud reverberating through the cabin. The room was once again filled with the normal sounds of the night, the crackling of the fire, the occasional chirp of a distant insect. But the air felt wrong, thick with something malevolent. "Is it gone?" Emily asked from her cot, her eyes wide with terror. Elizabeth didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. Instead, she turned to Miss Marjorie. "What is it? What has it become?" Miss Marjorie's face was pale, her eyes haunted. "It has found a way into the physical world. It's drawing power from this place, from the very earth itself. The longer it stays here, the stronger it will become." Elizabeth took a step back, her mind spinning. "We need to leave. We need to leave now." Miss Marjorie shook her head. "It's too late for that. The entity is bound to you, Elizabeth. It will follow you wherever you go." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. They were trapped. And the entity would not stop until it had everything it wanted. Elizabeth's mind spun, trying to grasp the magnitude of what Miss Marjorie had just said. "It's too late for that." The words hung in the air, suffocating her as she tried to process the horror of their situation. She had thought they might be able to escape, that they could run, find a place where the entity couldn't reach them. But now, the reality was settling in. There was no place they could hide, no sanctuary they could find. "We have to do something," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling but firm. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to grow stronger." Miss Marjorie's gaze was distant, as though she were weighing something in her mind. "The only thing that might stop it now is the heart," she said slowly. "The ritual. Couldn't we just destroy it?" Elizabeth interrupted, her voice rising. "If it's feeding on the land, on the earth itself, couldn't we just destroy it, burn it to nothing?" Miss Marjorie shook her head, her face a mask of grim resolve. "It's not that simple. Destroying it outright could unleash a far worse consequence. The entity is part of a much larger cycle. If you destroy it completely, it could create a rift, one that might consume everything around it. People, places, entire regions. You might not just be sacrificing yourself and Emily, but everyone in the area." Elizabeth felt as if the floor beneath her was crumbling away, her knees giving way as she sank back into a chair, her heart racing. "So we just have to live with it. It's just here now, and there's nothing we can do." "No," Miss Marjorie said, her voice soft but filled with an unspoken promise. "We can still contain it if we act fast. But we'll need to go to where it's strongest, the place where it first broke through. If we can close the rift completely, we might still have a chance to sever its hold on you." Elizabeth stood again, her breath catching. "Where is this place? How do we get there?" "It's near," Miss Marjorie said, her eyes narrowing. "The very spot where the entity's influence is the thickest. I can guide you, but we'll have to act quickly before it becomes too powerful." "Let me get Emily ready," Elizabeth said, a new surge of determination building in her chest. "We'll do whatever it takes." Miss Marjorie nodded, but her expression was still etched with the deep sorrow of someone who had seen too many of these battles end in devastation. Elizabeth knew the cost would be high, but there was no choice. She couldn't let this thing win. She moved quickly, gathering supplies, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She packed only the essentials, food, water, the ritual tools that Miss Marjorie had given her, and of course, the remnants of the heart. There was no time to waste. Emily was still on the cot, her small face pale and drawn. Her wide eyes followed Elizabeth's every move, her lips pressed tightly together in silence. "Emily," Elizabeth said, kneeling beside her daughter, "we have to go now. We're gonna be okay. I'll keep you safe. I promise." Emily nodded, though her lips trembled, and she reached for Elizabeth's hand. The trust in her daughter's eyes nearly broke Elizabeth's heart. She had no idea if she could keep that promise, but she would fight with every ounce of her strength to try. "Are you ready?" Miss Marjorie asked, her tone low but urgent. Elizabeth nodded, holding Emily close to her chest as they made their way to the door. She glanced back at the cabin one last time, the place that had been a fragile sanctuary for them in these dark days. The shadows outside had deepened, and the eerie stillness was broken only by the distant sound of the trees creaking in the wind. As they stepped into the night, Elizabeth felt it again, the weight, the pull of the entity's presence, pressing in from every side. It was as if the very air around her was charged with malice, a suffocating energy that made it hard to breathe. They walked quickly through the forest, Miss Marjorie leading the way with an intensity that matched Elizabeth's own. The trees seemed to grow thicker the deeper they went, the canopy overhead blocking out the last light of the moon. Elizabeth's pulse quickened, and she glanced around, half expecting the shadows to take form at any moment. Every step felt as though the ground itself was shifting beneath her feet, the trees closing in around them, blocking their escape. The deeper they ventured, the more the world around them felt like a twisted, distorted version of reality. Nothing was as it should be. Finally, they arrived at a clearing, a small, circular patch of ground surrounded by the gnarled, ancient trees. The air here was thick, oppressive, and the temperature had dropped dramatically, as if the very space were holding its breath. Miss Marjorie stopped at the center of the clearing, turning to Elizabeth. "This is it," she said softly. "The place where the entity first broke through." Elizabeth swallowed, looking around warily. There was something wrong with this place, something ancient and wrong in the very air. She could almost feel the pulse of the entity's presence beneath the earth, a slow, rhythmic thumping that made her skin crawl. "Now what?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tight with fear. Miss Marjorie nodded grimly. "We'll need to perform a final ritual, one last binding. It won't be easy, and it won't be without cost. But if we succeed, we can seal the rift, and the entity with it." Elizabeth looked at Emily, who had grown quiet, clutching her mother's side. "You'll be safe, sweetheart," Elizabeth whispered, though doubt gnawed at her. Could she truly protect Emily from this horror? Miss Marjorie began to move quickly, setting down the ritual tools and marking the ground with chalk. The symbols were ancient, intricate, glowing faintly as they were drawn in the dirt. Elizabeth's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. They were so close now, but she could feel it. The entity was watching, waiting, eager for their failure. "We have to do this," Elizabeth said through clenched teeth. "We can't let it win." The air seemed to vibrate with energy as Miss Marjorie continued her preparations. Each symbol she drew on the earth seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural glow, as though the very ground itself was responding to her actions. Elizabeth could feel the shift in the atmosphere, an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The entity was near, its presence seeping into the very fabric of the world around them. Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She glanced at Emily, who was standing close to her, clutching her mother's hand tightly. The little girl's wide eyes darted nervously between the symbols on the ground and the shadows of the trees that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Her small frame trembled, but she didn't speak. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart," Elizabeth whispered, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't sure if she could protect Emily from what was coming. Miss Marjorie finally stepped back, her eyes narrowed in concentration, as she surveyed the completed ritual circle. The symbols seemed to shimmer in the dim light, like ancient runes glowing with a life of their own. "We need to stand in the center," Miss Marjorie said, her voice quiet but firm. "Place your hands on the ground. We'll draw the entity to us, and then we'll bind it once and for all." Elizabeth nodded, feeling the weight of the decision in her bones. There was no turning back now. The heart, its shattered remnants, was still tucked away in her bag, the last piece of the puzzle. She could feel its faint pulse, a constant reminder of what had happened and what still needed to be done. Together, they stepped into the center of the circle, each of them kneeling beside the drawn symbols. Emily sat beside her mother, her fingers still clinging to Elizabeth's hand, her little face pale and tight with fear. Miss Marjorie took a deep breath, and Elizabeth watched as her hands began to move with practiced precision, tracing more symbols in the air, speaking in low, guttural tones that sent a shiver through Elizabeth's spine. The words felt old, ancient, and as she spoke, the air around them began to hum, thickening with the power of the ritual. Elizabeth felt the ground tremble beneath her knees as the shadows around the clearing deepened, the trees pressing in closer, as though the forest itself were leaning in to watch. The air seemed to grow colder still, each breath a visible cloud in the dim light. The entity was near, its presence so palpable that Elizabeth could almost hear it, a low, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated in her bones. Then, without warning, the shadows shifted. A figure emerged from the trees, slowly at first, its form flickering in and out of reality, like a half-formed nightmare. Elizabeth's heart raced as the figure grew clearer, and she realized with horror that it was not just a shadow. It was the entity, or at least a form of it. It slithered forward, its shape distorting, like liquid darkness spilling over itself. Its many eyes glowed, shifting in and out of focus, each one filled with an ancient hunger that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. She could feel its presence invade her mind, probing her thoughts, digging into her memories. "No," Elizabeth thought desperately. "I won't let it in. I won't give it what it wants." The entity hissed, its voice a raspy whisper that seemed to echo in the space around them. "You think you can banish me? You think you can hide forever?" Elizabeth's blood ran cold as the voice reached into her thoughts, tugging at her deepest fears, her most painful memories. She clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to scream, to let the terror of her past overwhelm her. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close. Miss Marjorie's voice broke through the fog of terror. "Focus, Elizabeth. Draw on your strength. Don't let it control you." Elizabeth's hands shook as she pressed them against the ground, her fingers sinking into the earth. The symbols glowed brighter now, their light growing more intense, almost blinding. The entity laughed, a chilling sound that made the very air seem to shudder. "You think these pathetic wards will save you? I am eternal. I will never be bound again." With a sudden, sharp movement, the entity lunged forward, its form shifting, tendrils of darkness reaching toward Elizabeth. She gasped as the shadows wrapped around her, pulling her closer, colder. The air felt like ice, like it was suffocating her, stealing the warmth from her skin. "Let go of her!" Miss Marjorie screamed, her voice filled with fury. Elizabeth's heart raced, panic flooding her veins. She felt the cold tendrils wrap tighter, squeezing the breath from her chest, the weight of the entity pressing in on her. But then, deep within her, something stirred. A surge of energy, a fire that refused to die. She focused on Emily, on the promise she had made to protect her daughter, to keep her safe no matter what. Elizabeth's fingers tightened on the ground, and the symbols flared with light, burning bright enough to drive the shadows back. "No," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking but filled with a newfound strength. "You will not win. Not today. The entity screeched, its form flickering and warping in the light. The shadows recoiled as the symbols began to pulse, their glow turning into a blinding flash. Elizabeth could feel the power of the ritual coursing through her, but it wasn't enough. The entity's will was strong, stronger than anything she had ever felt. "Elizabeth," Miss Marjorie called, her voice strained. "You need to focus. Use the heart. The last part of the ritual." Elizabeth's eyes snapped to the bag beside her, where the remnants of the heart lay. The shattered fragments glowed faintly, pulsing with the same eerie light that had filled the ruins. She knew what she had to do. With shaking hands, she pulled the heart from her bag, her breath catching as she held the pieces in her palms. The warmth from the heart seemed to surge through her, flooding her senses with a strange, unfamiliar energy. The entity shrieked again, a sound that rattled the very air around them, as if it could feel its hold slipping. "Elizabeth," Miss Marjorie urged. "Bind it now." Elizabeth closed her eyes, her breath steadying as she focused on the heart. She didn't know how she knew, but somehow in this moment she understood. The ritual was incomplete without the heart. It was the final piece, the key to severing the entity's hold on their world. She held the heart high, chanting the words Miss Marjorie had taught her, her voice steady as she called on the power of the earth, the light, and the ancient spirits bound to this place. The symbols beneath her hands flared brighter, the ground shaking with a force that rattled her bones. The entity screamed again, its form flickering, struggling to hold on, but it was losing ground. Elizabeth didn't stop. She pressed the heart down into the earth, feeling the pulse of its energy, its power, as it sank into the ground. And as the heart touched the earth, the world seemed to explode in light. The entity's scream was cut off, its form disintegrating into nothingness, swallowed by the blinding glow that surrounded them. The earth trembled, and then slowly everything went still. The clearing was silent, save for the distant rustling of the trees in the wind. The silence that fell over the clearing was unnerving, a stillness so profound that Elizabeth could hear her own heartbeat racing in her chest. She slowly opened her eyes, her breath shallow, expecting the entity to return at any moment. But there was nothing. The oppressive weight of its presence had lifted, leaving the air feeling strangely clean, as if a dark cloud had been lifted from the earth itself. Miss Marjorie was standing beside her, her eyes wide, the exhaustion of the ritual written on her face. She had a slight smile, but it was tinged with sadness, as if she knew the cost of what they had just done. "It's done," Miss Marjorie whispered, her voice shaky but relieved. "You did it, Elizabeth. The entity is gone." Elizabeth's hands shook as she slowly stood, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. She glanced down at the ground where the heart had sunk, and to her surprise, the symbols had faded. The earth, once dark and heavy with malevolent energy, now felt peaceful, almost serene. But as the tension began to melt away, Elizabeth felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest. It was over, yes. The entity was gone, but the victory felt hollow. She had seen the depths of the darkness it had brought, and no matter how much she wanted to feel relief, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been lost. Emily was standing next to her, her small face a mix of exhaustion and fear. She clung to Elizabeth's side, her tiny hand gripping her mother's arm as if to reassure herself that she was still there. Elizabeth knelt down and pulled her daughter into her arms, breathing in the familiar warmth of Emily's body. She was safe. They were safe. But Elizabeth knew that this peace would not last. There was still so much more to unravel. "We did it," Elizabeth whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "But it's not over." Miss Marjorie glanced at her, her expression somber. "You're right. The entity may be gone, but there's still the question of what it was doing here, what it was feeding on." The land, the mansion, you. She hesitated before continuing, her voice low. The heart might have bound it, but the truth about your family, that's still a wound that needs to be healed. Elizabeth's stomach twisted, and a chill ran through her. She remembered the cryptic letters she had found in the mansion, the whispers that had filled the halls during the nights they spent there. The mansion's history was dark, and it had always seemed like there was something more, something hidden, just beyond their reach. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What truth?" Miss Marjorie sighed heavily, looking toward the mansion in the distance. The entity didn't just appear on its own. It was summoned, and it was tied to your bloodline. Your family's past. Elizabeth froze, her breath catching. She had always known there was something strange about the mansion, something that didn't quite sit right. But hearing Miss Marjorie speak of her family's connection to the entity sent a cold shiver up her spine. "How?" she whispered. "How is it tied to us?" Miss Marjorie didn't answer immediately, her gaze distant, as though she were reliving something painful. Finally, she spoke. "There are rituals, old forbidden rituals, tied to the power of the land itself. Your ancestor, the one who first built the mansion, made a pact with dark forces to secure wealth and power. The price was steep. Every generation after would pay for the privilege. They would be bound to the entity, feeding it, sustaining it. And when it finally grew strong enough, it would rise again." Elizabeth felt her stomach turn, nausea rising up her throat. "So my family, we were cursed?" "Yes," Miss Marjorie said softly, "but not everyone knew. The curse was hidden, buried beneath layers of secrecy and lies. The mansion, your inheritance, it was meant to be a trap, a lure. The entity needed you to complete its cycle." Elizabeth stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. "And now, Miss Marjorie said, her voice hardening, "you can choose. The ritual may have sealed the entity, but the land is still poisoned. The curse will continue to fester unless you choose to end it. You must sever the ties completely, destroy the mansion, burn it to the ground. Only then can you truly free yourself, your family, and the land." Elizabeth's heart raced in her chest. It seemed impossible, the idea of destroying everything she had just inherited. The house, the land, it was all that remained of her family's history, her heritage. But she looked down at Emily, who was still clutching her side, her tiny face a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. Elizabeth had never been one to back away from a fight, and now she knew what she had to do. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "I'll destroy it. I won't let this curse follow us any longer." Miss Marjorie nodded solemnly. "I'll help you, but we must hurry. The longer the mansion remains standing, the stronger the curse will become. If we wait too long—" "I understand," Elizabeth said, cutting her off. "Let's go." They started back toward the mansion, the weight of what they had to do pressing down on Elizabeth's shoulders. With each step, she could feel the familiar pull of the place, the strange magnetism that had always drawn her in, even when she had known it was wrong. As they reached the front gate, Elizabeth hesitated for just a moment, staring up at the mansion's looming, decaying facade. There was a part of her that still felt drawn to it, a part that ached with the loss of everything it had once represented: family, history, legacy. But deep down, she knew that there could be no future for her or Emily here. "We're doing the right thing," Miss Marjorie said softly, as if reading Elizabeth's thoughts. "This house, it has no place in this world anymore." Elizabeth nodded, her resolve hardening. She glanced down at Emily, who was staring up at the mansion with wide, frightened eyes. "It's over, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, her voice gentle but filled with determination. "This place, this nightmare, it ends tonight." The mansion loomed before them, its twisted, decaying form barely visible in the dimming light. The air around it felt thick with an unseen presence, as if the house itself were watching, waiting. Elizabeth could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the sins of her ancestors echoing through the walls. She took a steadying breath, trying to push away the dark thoughts that were creeping in. There was no turning back now. The curse had to end. Miss Marjorie led the way toward the grand front doors, her steps quick and purposeful. The gates creaked in protest as they pushed open, revealing the mansion's crumbling facade. As they walked up the steps, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice how the air seemed to grow colder, as though the house itself exhaled a breath of frost. When they reached the door, Elizabeth hesitated for just a moment, her hand hovering over the handle. She could feel the power inside, the malevolent energy that had been trapped here for so long. But there was no turning back. She gripped the handle and pushed the door open. The house was eerily quiet inside, save for the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and mildew, but there was something else, something darker, lurking beneath the surface. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing with a malevolent will of its own. As they stepped inside, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The shadows grew longer, twisting unnaturally, as if they were stretching to touch them. The faintest whisper of movement could be heard from the far corners of the mansion, a sound so faint that it could easily be dismissed as the settling of the building, but Elizabeth knew better. She had heard those whispers before. "Stay close," Elizabeth whispered to Emily, pulling her gently into her side. Emily nodded, her wide eyes flickering around the room as though expecting something to leap from the darkness. The child had seen enough horrors in her short life already. Elizabeth vowed silently that she would make sure Emily would never have to face another nightmarish reality again. They made their way through the mansion's dimly lit halls, past portraits of long-dead relatives whose eyes seemed to follow them with unsettling intensity. The mansion was full of relics of the past, artifacts from a time when the family had been proud of its wealth and power. But now, those same objects seemed to exude nothing but a grim aura, as though they had absorbed the very darkness that had taken root here. Finally, they reached the grand staircase, its banister worn with age. Elizabeth hesitated, glancing up toward the second floor. She could feel the pull of something up there, something waiting. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to ascend the stairs, one step at a time. The air grew colder the higher they climbed, and as they reached the second floor, Elizabeth felt a knot of dread settle in her stomach. The hallway stretched ahead of them, lined with closed doors that seemed to loom, their dark surfaces hiding what horrors might lie beyond. Miss Marjorie's footsteps faltered for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "The heart, the ritual, it must be done in the center of the house," she said, her voice low and filled with urgency. "That's where the entity's power is strongest. We must destroy it there." Elizabeth's heart raced as she nodded, her grip tightening around Emily's hand. She glanced around, searching for the source of the overwhelming sense of dread. The house felt like it was closing in on them, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. They continued down the hallway, and as they passed one of the doors, a faint sound reached Elizabeth's ears, a whisper, soft and unintelligible. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, as if something or someone was watching them. She turned to Miss Marjorie, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" Miss Marjorie's expression darkened. "The house is trying to stop us. It will do everything in its power to prevent the ritual. It won't go down without a fight." Elizabeth's eyes widened in realization. She knew that whatever they were about to face, it was not going to be easy. The entity, even in its defeated state, was still tied to the house. And if the ritual was to succeed, they would have to face its final, most dangerous form. They reached the final door at the end of the hall, and Elizabeth's heart thudded in her chest. The door was ancient, its wood scarred with deep gouges, as if something, or someone, had tried to break through from the other side. Miss Marjorie reached for the handle and turned it slowly, her movements deliberate, as though she were expecting something to happen. As the door creaked open, a rush of cold air surged out, the unmistakable scent of decay and earth filling the room. Inside, the room was nothing like the others. The walls were covered in strange symbols, the same ones that had been drawn in the clearing earlier. But here, they were carved into the stone, etched deep into the surface, as if they had been made centuries ago. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it lay a small, weathered box. "This is it," Miss Marjorie said softly, her voice reverberating in the stillness of the room. "This is where it all began." Elizabeth stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the box. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to reach out and open it. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft cloth, was the final piece, the remnants of the heart. The box felt cold to the touch, and as she lifted the heart, a faint hum filled the room. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very house were alive, reacting to the presence of the heart. Elizabeth held it in her hands, feeling the faint thrum of its energy, its power. The ritual had been completed before, but she knew that this was the final step. She had to destroy the heart, sever its connection to the entity once and for all. "Are you ready?" Miss Marjorie asked, her voice tight with tension. Elizabeth nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes." She took a deep breath and raised the heart high, feeling the energy of the house push against her, but she didn't waver. The power of the curse, the entity's lingering presence, it was all here, in this very room. But she would not let it control her. With one final, determined motion, Elizabeth brought the heart down onto the stone pedestal. There was a blinding flash of light, followed by an overwhelming wave of force that sent her sprawling back against the floor. The world spun, and for a moment, Elizabeth couldn't tell if she was alive or dead. But then, slowly, the light faded, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the mansion began to lift. The cold, the weight, the fear, it was all gone. Elizabeth pushed herself to her feet, her heart still racing. She looked around, her eyes wide with disbelief. The mansion, the land, the curse, it was all over. And yet, as she stood there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was still watching, lingering just beyond the edges of her vision. The room remained still, but there was an unsettling silence that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. The cold air, which had once felt thick and suffocating, now seemed almost still, as if it were holding its breath. Elizabeth felt a tremor in her bones, but she knew deep down that they had done it. The entity was gone. The heart had been destroyed, severing the bond between the mansion and whatever malevolent force had ruled over it for so long. Miss Marjorie, who had been watching the entire process with a hawk-like intensity, exhaled sharply. "It's done," she whispered, though her voice sounded distant, as if she too was unsure whether they had truly freed themselves from the mansion's grip. Elizabeth felt a weight lift off her shoulders, the burden of the curse finally broken. But as the dust settled and the tension in the room began to ease, she couldn't help but notice that the air felt different. It was almost as if the house itself was still alive, its pulse faint but insistent beneath the surface. Emily tugged on her mother's sleeve, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom, is it over?" Elizabeth smiled down at her daughter, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. It's over. We're safe." But even as she said the words, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. She glanced around the room, her gaze settling on the strange symbols that covered the walls. The markings, though faded, were still visible, etched into the very stone, as though the house had been built with them in mind. Could the ritual truly have severed all the connections to the entity? Or had something been left behind, lingering, waiting to rise again? "Are you sure?" Elizabeth asked Miss Marjorie, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you sure that was it? That the entity won't return?" Miss Marjorie looked at her with an expression that was a mix of exhaustion and resignation. "The entity, it's gone. But the land, the mansion, they are still tainted. What your ancestors did, they left a mark on this place. It will take time for the curse to fade completely, if it ever does. The mansion's power is broken, but the land itself still holds the echoes of that darkness." Elizabeth nodded slowly, understanding what Miss Marjorie was saying. The house might no longer be a physical prison for the entity, but the curse had seeped into the very bones of the land. There was still work to be done. "Then we burn it," Elizabeth said firmly. "We end this once and for all." Miss Marjorie gave a solemn nod. "Yes, the mansion must be destroyed. If you want to ensure the curse is gone for good, you'll have to let the flames purify it." Elizabeth's resolve hardened. She couldn't let this place remain, even as a memory. It had taken too much from her family, and from Emily. It had caused nothing but suffering, and now it was time for it to be erased. They made their way back downstairs, their footsteps echoing through the halls, but this time there was no oppressive weight pressing down on them. The air felt lighter, as if the mansion itself was in mourning, its final breath before it was consumed by the flames. Elizabeth's hand tightened around Emily's, and she could sense that her daughter, despite the terror they had faced, was starting to feel a glimmer of hope. When they reached the front door, Elizabeth turned to Miss Marjorie. "Do you have the fire?" she asked, her voice resolute. Miss Marjorie nodded, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a small vial filled with a clear liquid. "This should do the trick," she said, handing it to Elizabeth. "It's a mixture of oil and herbs, used in rituals to purify and burn away curses." Elizabeth took the vial, holding it in her hands with a mixture of reverence and finality. This was it, the last step. The three of them walked outside, the chill of the evening air biting at their skin. The mansion loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the fading light of the day. Elizabeth could see the faintest glow from within, as if the mansion itself were watching them, waiting for them to make their move. "This is for you, Emily," Elizabeth whispered under her breath. "This is for us, for our future." She unscrewed the vial and poured the liquid around the base of the mansion, tracing the lines of the property with careful precision. As the liquid spread, a faint warmth began to radiate from it, and Elizabeth could almost feel the air thickening with energy. The house had begun to respond, its power lurching to life one last time, but Elizabeth didn't falter. "Now we burn it," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. Miss Marjorie stepped forward, her hands raised high. "The flames will purify," she chanted softly. "The darkness will be consumed, the bloodline severed, the curse broken." With that, she reached into her robe and pulled out a match. She struck it against the stone and held it high, her eyes glowing with determination. She dropped the match onto the ground, and a small flame flickered to life at the base of the mansion. At first, nothing happened, but then, slowly, a low rumble echoed through the ground. The air shimmered as the flame began to grow, rapidly expanding into a roaring blaze that engulfed the mansion. The flames crackled and snapped, licking the walls of the building as the fire spread faster than Elizabeth had imagined. She could feel the heat on her skin, but she stood firm, watching as the fire consumed the mansion. The house, once so imposing, now seemed fragile in the face of its destruction. The walls groaned and creaked as the structure began to collapse, the flames burning away everything that had once made it strong. And yet, as the fire raged, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt too still, too silent, as if the world around her had paused. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at Emily, who stood beside her, her small face pale but filled with a strange, knowing look. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "It's not over. Not yet." Elizabeth's stomach dropped as the words hit her. A chill ran down her spine as she turned to Miss Marjorie, who was staring at the fire with an unreadable expression. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked urgently. "What's happening?" Miss Marjorie didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward, her hand pressed to her forehead as if she were trying to focus on something beyond the fire. "The entity is gone, yes," she said slowly. "But there are other forces at play here. Forces tied to the land itself." Elizabeth's blood ran cold as she realized what Miss Marjorie meant. The curse was only the beginning. The air around them seemed to tremble, as though something invisible was stirring beneath the heat of the flames. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat, the sense of dread returning with full force. She turned her eyes to the burning mansion, its fiery skeleton now casting long, flickering shadows that danced and twisted unnaturally. Miss Marjorie's face had gone pale, her eyes narrowing with an almost predatory intensity. "We must leave," she urged, her voice sharp and commanding. "Now." "Why?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper, the fear creeping into her tone. "What's happening?" Miss Marjorie didn't respond immediately, her gaze still locked on the inferno. But Elizabeth could see the conflict in her eyes, the lingering hesitation that told her something far worse was unfolding. The fire, the very flames they had hoped would cleanse the mansion, seemed to be feeding something else, something hidden deep within the land itself. "Whatever was left behind," Miss Marjorie began, her words slow and deliberate, "it's not over. The mansion, the land, it was never just a house. It's a vessel, a gateway. Destroying it won't erase everything." Elizabeth felt a cold shiver creep down her spine, a slow, crawling fear that gripped her heart. The mansion, she now realized, had been built on ancient, cursed grounds, long predating her family's arrival. This was no ordinary family estate. It was a place of rituals, of hidden rites that had called upon forces far beyond their understanding. "Can we stop it?" Elizabeth demanded, stepping forward, her eyes wild with panic. She had already lost so much to this place. She couldn't afford to lose more. Miss Marjorie shook her head, her expression grim. "There's no stopping it now. The fire may have severed the entity's hold on the mansion, but the land, it's still alive. It has its own will." Before Elizabeth could process what Miss Marjorie had said, a low, rumbling sound vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. The fire, which had been consuming the mansion in a frenzy, began to spiral upward, twisting into a monstrous column of flame. The wind howled, picking up speed and strength, almost as if the world itself were reacting to the chaos unfolding. Emily's small, trembling hand clutched Elizabeth's, her voice quivering. "Mom, I don't want to be here anymore." Elizabeth wanted to comfort her, to promise her everything would be okay. But the truth was, she wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure that any of them were safe. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, a tremor running through the earth that sent them all stumbling. The fire was no longer just a fire. It had transformed into something else. The flames licked at the sky, but they were now tinged with an eerie, unnatural glow, burning with a violet hue that made the entire scene look like something out of a nightmare. Miss Marjorie turned to face them, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave." "No." She began to back away, But before she could take another step, the ground erupted with a violent force. Elizabeth cried out, grabbing Emily and pulling her close as a jagged crack split the earth in front of them. From the fissure, something dark began to emerge, something that was not part of the fire, not part of the land, but something older. It was a figure tall and towering, its shape obscured by the rising smoke and flames. The air around it seemed to warp and bend, the shadows falling away from it as if it was drawing them in. The presence that surrounded it was suffocating, cold, and unnatural, and Elizabeth could feel its weight pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. "No," Miss Marjorie whispered in disbelief, stepping back. "It's not possible." Elizabeth watched in horror as the figure slowly and deliberately took shape, revealing a being cloaked in darkness, its face a blur of shifting features, too vague and grotesque to comprehend. Its eyes, however, burned with a deep, smoldering intensity, like two pools of molten fire that bore into her very soul. "What is it?" Elizabeth gasped, barely able to form the words. "The land, it's alive," Miss Marjorie replied, her voice trembling. "It wasn't just cursed, it was inhabited. A living force of darkness, bound to the land long before your family arrived. What we destroyed was just a vessel. This is the true evil." The figure took another step forward, its form growing clearer with each passing moment. The very air around it seemed to vibrate with an unnatural frequency, creating an overwhelming sense of nausea that threatened to overpower Elizabeth. She stumbled back, pulling Emily with her, but there was nowhere to go. "Stay back," Miss Marjorie ordered, but her voice lacked conviction. There was fear in her eyes, real, deep fear that sent a chill through Elizabeth's heart. The figure seemed to pause, its shifting face still a blur of indistinct horror. But the eyes, those burning eyes, stared directly at them. And then, in an instant, the earth beneath their feet trembled violently. The ground split further, sending Elizabeth and Emily sprawling to the floor. The figure's form rippled with strange, unnatural energy as the ground cracked open completely, a massive chasm forming between them and the burning mansion. Elizabeth pulled Emily close, trying to shield her from the terrifying sight. Her mind raced. The fire had not worked. The curse had not been broken. Instead, they had unleashed something far worse. Miss Marjorie fell to her knees, her hands raised as if to ward off the presence, but the creature was unstoppable. It loomed over them, an embodiment of the land's rage, the deep, festering darkness that had been buried for centuries. "You should not have come," it intoned, its voice deep and hollow, echoing in the air like a whisper from the grave. Elizabeth's heart stopped. The voice, it was not human. It was the land speaking through the figure, the curse speaking through it. What do you want?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice barely a whisper, her hands trembling as she held Emily tight against her chest. The figure's eyes narrowed, its form twisting like smoke caught in the wind. "I want nothing," it hissed. I always have been." Elizabeth's mind raced. There had to be something, anything, they could do to stop this. The fire had failed, and now they were face to face with an ancient evil that was far beyond anything she could have imagined. "I can't," Elizabeth whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "We can't stop it." But then she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Miss Marjorie, her face pale but filled with resolve, stood beside her. "There is one way," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "But it requires a sacrifice." Elizabeth turned to her, eyes wide. "A sacrifice? What are you talking about?" Miss Marjorie's expression darkened. This land was never just cursed. It was bound. To destroy it, you must sever its connection to this world. To do that, you must give something of yourself and allow the land to consume it. Elizabeth's pulse raced. The weight of the decision threatened to crush her. "Are you willing to do it?" Miss Marjorie asked, her gaze piercing. "To finally end this nightmare?" Elizabeth's mind spun with the weight of Miss Marjorie's words. A sacrifice. It was the only way to stop the creature, to stop the land from consuming everything they had left. But could she do it? Could she truly give up something so precious, something so vital, just to save her daughter and herself? What would it cost? Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear and disbelief. She had already lost so much: her husband, her family's safety, her peace of mind. And now this? Another choice, one that could demand the ultimate price? Miss Marjorie's gaze softened, but her face was etched with the burden of knowing what had to be done. The land is bound by blood, Elizabeth. Blood that is tied to your family's past. The only way to break the cycle is for someone from your bloodline to give themselves to it. The sacrifice, it will sever the connection. It will burn away the darkness that has clung to this land for centuries. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. The land, the curse, it was all tied to her family. She felt the weight of her ancestors' sins pressed down on her, as if they were the ones demanding retribution. She thought of Emily, her daughter, standing beside her, terrified but alive. She couldn't let the darkness claim her. She wouldn't. "No," Elizabeth whispered, shaking her head. "I won't do it. I can't." "Emily," her voice cracked, her eyes welling with tears as she looked down at her daughter, the one person in this world she loved more than anything. Emily, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, her tiny voice breaking through the tension. "Mom," she said softly, her eyes wide and knowing, "you have to do it. It's the only way." Elizabeth looked at her, her breath catching in her throat. The look in Emily's eyes was different, calm, almost accepting, as if Emily, too, had understood that this moment had come. The weight of her family's legacy had caught up to them, and now it was their responsibility to end it. "No," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "You don't understand. I won't let you." But Emily shook her head. "I do understand, Mom. I do. You always told me we had to face our fears, to do what was right, no matter how hard it was." She looked up at the figure, then back at her mother. "This is the right thing. It has to be." Elizabeth's heart shattered as she looked at her daughter, seeing her innocence and wisdom intertwined. She knew Emily was right. She couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep trying to protect her from everything. Sometimes, the only way to protect someone was to let them go. "Emily," Elizabeth whispered, her hands trembling as she touched her daughter's face. "I love you." And then, with a heart heavy with sorrow, she turned to face the dark figure that loomed over them. The land's embodiment, the curse's final manifestation, was waiting, watching, hungry. "I'll do it," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the fear flooding her veins. "I'll give myself to the land, but I will make sure this ends." The figure's eyes gleamed with a malevolent satisfaction, its form shifting, growing in power as it awaited her decision. "You are wise, Elizabeth. You understand the cost." Elizabeth nodded, swallowing her fear. She reached into her chest, feeling the deep connection to the land that had been passed down through her bloodline. She could feel the dark energy swirling beneath her skin, pulling at her, trying to consume her. As she stood before the entity, her body trembled, but she stood tall. She thought of Emily. Her daughter would be free of the curse. She would have a life, a future. Elizabeth's sacrifice would ensure that. The land, the house, the curse, it had taken enough. It would take her now, but not without taking its final breath first. "I am ready," Elizabeth said, her voice clear. And then she closed her eyes. In an instant, the world seemed to collapse into darkness. The land, once cold and cursed, seemed to awaken with a terrible power. The dark figure reached toward her, its hands outstretched, its form merging with the very air around her. And then, with a final, breathless moment, Elizabeth felt the pull, darkness consuming light, life consumed by the very land that had given it. But it was not the end of her. Not for her, and not for Emily. As the darkness swallowed her, Elizabeth felt a strange peace, a peace that whispered of release and finality. And then there was only silence. When Elizabeth opened her eyes again, she found herself standing in the same place, except it was different. The air was lighter. The ground beneath her feet no longer felt oppressive. The dark figure was gone, the mansion reduced to ashes in the distance. The curse, the malevolent force that had haunted this land for centuries, had finally been purged. She looked around, her breath coming in slow, measured gasps. Emily stood there, a safe distance away, her eyes wide but filled with understanding. And in her hands, Elizabeth saw something she never thought she'd see again. Her daughter, free from the curse, alive. The land was quiet now. The house was gone. The dark legacy had been erased. And Elizabeth, in that final act, had ensured that Emily's future would be free of the past. Together, they walked away from the ruins of the mansion, the ashes of their family's dark legacy. As they reached the horizon, the sun began to rise, casting its golden light over the land. The curse was broken. The inheritance was no longer a burden, and the future, whatever it held, was theirs to shape. Elizabeth's sacrifice had given them that. That's the end of the story. Make sure to like and subscribe.